Hello, I'm Jothy Rosenberg, the host of Designing Successful Startups, where today's guest is Ray Bradbery.
And I think that really set me up when Belinda Hanna, who was managing director of Borland in Australia, came and said, could you start a consulting practice? Well, sure, why not? I've never done it before, but how hard can it be? So when Belinda asked me to do the job, I sat down and said, well, how do I make this work? I've got no budget. I've got no support from anywhere other than a blank sheet of paper that says start a consulting practice.
Ray spent the early part of his working career in the IT department of Australia's largest bank. Then Ray joined Borland Software, where he and I met, where he had an initial role to start a consulting practice, something that was a new function for Borland Software. Ray went on to managing director of the Australian and New Zealand operations of Borland. In a gap in his IT career, Ray took time out to open and operate a Greek cafe and a Greek restaurant. So he's a qualified barista and a Greek cook. In his outside of work life, Ray is a keen cyclist, having ridden several times from Sydney to the Gold Coast, a distance of 640 miles. Ray is married with 2 daughters and a son. One daughter and his son have accompanied him on his marathon rides. The final daughter thinks he's a lunatic. Maybe she's right. And here is Ray.
Here's Ray, all the way from Australia. Good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is where you are, Jothy.
Yeah, it's afternoon here and it's morning for you.
Yeah, it's going to be a great day tomorrow because we're already there.
You're already there. I know that's always pretty strange.
It is.
So, I always like to kind of start with asking you, where are you originally from and where do you live now?
Okay, so I was born here in Sydney. Unusual story. I was actually born in an ambulance on the way to the hospital, so I couldn't wait. But lived most of my life in Sydney. I did spend 2 years in Papua New Guinea. I got sent up there to help a bank up there computerize. So moved from accounting machines to online computing. So that was interesting. And then came back to Sydney. But ever since 1994, I guess my life has pretty much been on a plane somewhere, having worked for global software companies ever since then. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, and it's pretty much a long flight anywhere from you, from Australia.
Yeah. Well,
so I know you had a pretty long career in the IT department of a major bank. And then after that you joined Borland, and that's where we first met.
Correct.
Right? Yeah.
Yep.
And then you made you made another shift. Well, when you were at Borland, they asked you to make the company have a shift to building a consulting practice, which they never had before. So you had to create something new that Borland never had. You had to do it thousands of miles away from the mothership. And I never asked you back then, how did that look out?
Well, it was funny because, as I said, I was at the Commonwealth Bank of Australia for 23 years in their IT department. I was head of IT strategy for 5 years. I was CIO for their insurance business for the last couple of years I was there. And I think that really set me up when Belinda Hanna, who was managing director of Borland in Australia, came and said, could you start a consulting practice? Well, sure, why not? I've never done it before, but how hard can it be? And I think the thing that set me up is for a long time, I had been working with a range of suppliers to the bank because when I was running strategic planning, we did all of the purchasing of technology for the bank. So hardware, software. I worked with the Microsofts, IBMs, storage, text, whatever of the world But I also worked with small consulting practices or small software companies who were looking to sell whatever they had to the bank. And so I understood their mindset. How does a company that really hasn't got that much credentials sell to, in those days, I think the bank had about 56,000 employees, and it was the largest bank in Australia, which it still is today. And so when Belinda asked me to do the job, I sat down and said, well, how do I make this work? I've got no budget. I've got no support from anywhere other than a blank sheet of paper that says start a consulting practice. But I started to look at how Borland operated. And the thing that I think was the first eye-opener was they had this thing called Team B, where they had all of these fans out in the community who were providing support. And so I started to reach out to the Team B people in Australia and, started to work out what their capabilities were, what they did. And then so essentially started a virtual consulting practice. So there was me who was out there selling, writing procedures and policies, etc. But I had a team of virtual consultants who would go in, pretend they were Borland. So, it was Borland selling to these large organizations. So that gave us the credibility because we were well known. But we were giving these consultants a lifeline into organizations they could never have hoped to get in through the door. And so that's how we built that consulting practice. And we turned over $1 million in the first 12 months with one employee, me.
So obviously, Borland asking you to do this was because they thought it would help sell more product because it was a product company. And I'm just curious, while you were doing that, I was over in the languages division and eventually was running the languages division. What were the products from like Turbo Pascal, Delphi, Borland C++, or was it over in the application space? What was the product that you were going to do the consulting with or for?
Okay, so the initial projects we won were around Paradox. So we won a contract at Citi to build a system to track some of their financials. We built a system for the Commonwealth Bank of Australia to track their securitization of products. So it was mainly around Paradox in those early days, but then it quickly shifted to Delphi as it became, the VB killer. Everyone was talking about it and people were looking for solutions, and we would go in and pitch a Delphi solution. And but then we also started to expand in some of the other products that Borland had that were on the peripheral. So there was Delphi 400, which I'm not sure whether you remember that or not, but we successfully sold that. There was Delphi Connect for SAP, and so we successfully sold that. So we were pretty much listening to what the customers were asking for and creating something no matter what the Borland product was. And the reason that they were thinking about this consulting, and as I say, it was a renegade project kicked off in Australia, so it didn't have any formal endorsement by the company, was they were, in Australia, they were watching Oracle, who in those days was expanding into services to complement their product sales. And so, the thinking was that if we could provide solutions to customers, we could also sell product into those companies as well. We did some massive projects for Brisbane City Council, where we built a standard common desktop where they could access all their back-end applications using the Corba as the interface to those back-end systems. We built a system for JB Weir, which is one of the biggest stockbroking firms in Australia at that stage. Again, punching well above our weight. But I think part of the reason was because I had previously worked in a very large organization and had a CIO role, I had credibility but I also understood how they thought. So I could put myself on the other side of the desk and, for example, they'd say, oh, we've got no money. You knew that what they were actually telling you was, I can't spend any capital, but I maybe could spend operating. So you would pitch it and don't pay us for the product up front, pay us over 6 months or something, because that relieves their budget issues, etc. So that helped.
Sure. One funny story I can tell you about Delphi is that when I first got to Borland, they had recently shipped Turbo Pascal 10, and they had been on a very steep decline in how much revenue they made on each version of Turbo Pascal. At a time previous, they had almost gotten to 100 million a year on Turbo Pascal, and they were now down to about, I don't know, in the 20s maybe. And it was a disaster. And at the same time, the new client server revolution was taking place.
Yep.
And so, you know, the leaders of the Pascal team, Anders Heilsberg in particular, figured, okay, we pretty much own Turbo Pascal. We can do anything we want with it because there's just no one else selling it at all. And we're going to make it into a client server tool. And the other thing we have to do is stop calling it Pascal. And so they came up with the name Delphi, which is another story. But and then, so basically, Delphi was Turbo Pascal 11. And in its first go out into the market, it went back above 100 million a year.
Yes, I did the launch of Delphi in Australia, and I can still remember the enthusiasm in the audience for the VB killer. And we got some great press. We converted one of the, entrepreneurial software companies in those days to use Delphi to rebuild their product from VB. We got threatened with lawsuits by Microsoft for disparaging their product. But yeah, it was an incredible wave to ride.
And as the person in charge of Borland C++, I also had Microsoft threaten me.
Well, that must mean we're doing something right.
So the other thing that you did, again, you could do things that we didn't notice, and you could get away with doing whatever you wanted, basically. And one of the things you did was you set up operations for Borland in China and India and South Korea, and maybe there's others. And each one of those was basically a startup. And I just wonder because there's no easy startup. So what were the challenges of trying to move Borland into those new markets?
Well, China was the interesting one because they had regulations that said you couldn't have an operation there unless you had 51% local ownership. And there was no way we were going to do that. So we battled for nearly 12 months to Joanne Birmingham, who was legal counsel in those days, helped me, and we kept fighting and eventually got a wholly owned subsidiary in China. So, but that was interesting, negotiating with government in China, where you walk through the door with someone walking behind you with a rifle, was always interesting. But that was probably the hardest. And, of course, the piracy issues that you had trying to sell into that market, because we were always guarding our intellectual property very carefully, because I think it was one of the JBuilder releases where we had built-in anti-piracy software. And before we even launched it, there was code in China to crack it. So it was... But I always saw that as an opportunity that we would offer amnesties, for example, we know you've got an illegal copy of this stuff. We'll give you a lower price if you become legal. So that was one. The language barriers are always interesting. And I guess the other thing you're always dealing with is Asia Pacific is very different to the US, but headquarters always had a view that, well, what it works in the US, it must work everywhere else. And so we used to pride ourselves on, again, doing something totally different. I remember it was Dale Fuller coming to me and say, how come you're selling this and no one else can? I said, because we don't do what you tell us to do. We do what we think's right. And sometimes that's just what you got to do.
Was it? I assume you got the translation into Chinese done locally. Not you didn't get that done back in the States. You had it done in China, I assume.
No, we didn't translate. We sold English product into China. Yes, the only market we actually changed the product for was Japan, where we had an R&D lab there who would do the localization. And that was always a challenge, but we found that mostly the IT communities in China and Taiwan, etc., were able to use English product.
I'm sure the Japanese could have as well, but they just preferred not.
They refused. You're correct.
Okay, they refused.
They had a very big R&D lab there that they liked to keep. But it was always a challenge, again, because there was always a 6-month lag between you releasing one of your tools and us being able to ship a Japanese version. So it meant that there was always a lag in the revenue, which, again, the US had difficulty understanding why this 6-month lag.
Okay. So after you left Borland, you've actually, it sounds like at 2 different stints you've helped mentor startups, and I guess you mostly focused on their sales and marketing. What stands out? What sort of lessons or key sort of takeaways do you offer up to entrepreneurs that are listening to this about what you learned doing that sort of mentoring?
Yeah, I think one of the common pitfalls is you will find that they'll build a product because they think it's a good idea and therefore the market must want it, without doing the research that you really need to do up front is, who's going to buy it? How are they going to use it? What price will they actually pay? And, I kind of learnt some really important lessons around that at Borland when they were creating Kylix, the open source version of Delphi, in that we priced it really high and tried to sell it into a market that was expecting product to be free. And I think that was the death knell of the product. It was a great product. It did everything they said it would do, but it was just not priced in a way that the market would pay for it. So it failed. And so that's one of the things that when I'm talking to an entrepreneur is, what research did you do before you even started building this? Did you work out who's the market, how you're going to sell it? I worked with a couple where they thought the way that you launch the product, give it away for free. But without a strategy that says, well, that's all well and good to get the product into the marketplace, but what strategy have you got to actually monetize it at some time in the future? And, I was working for a period of time with a company called Service Rocket, which was Atlassian's first partner in the world. And, I observed what they did, which is early entry to the market was they gave product away, but then they would build an enhanced version of it that you paid for. And so built a really successful software business. It's do your homework up front, make sure that there is the demand for the product, that it's not just you think it's a great idea, therefore everyone will buy it. And also, how are you going to market the product? Again, I quite often found that they would just put it up on a website somewhere and wonder why no one came knocking. So it really does need that upfront promotion, etc. And again, that was a lesson that I learned in the Delphi days, is that product was sold based on hype more than it was sold on its capabilities in the early parts of it, because everyone was talking about this thing coming. And so the market was anticipating it. And that's what a lot of these startups fall down on, is they don't do the upfront work to build a hunger for what it is they're building.
I think you're basically right, but I want to give credit where credit is due. There was a product manager, and he was sort of sidekick to Anders Heilsberg, who was really the genius architect. And the guy I'm referring to is a guy named Zach Erlacher.
I know Zach pretty well. I was talking to him a couple of months ago.
and one of my favorite people. And Zach,
yep.
and there were the equivalent kind of person in almost every successful product, at least within the languages domain. I mean, I had one for JBuilder, I had one for C++, I had one I owned DBase too, which was kind of not really in that same mix, but I had DBase too. And it's funny because I have a hard time explaining to people nowadays that a product management person ought to be really early in the hiring at a startup. And instead, people like to, the first marketing person that they want is an outbound marketing person. And I've done that too. But you need an inbound marketing person. That's what product management is. And Zach would go out, he would be testing messaging, and he would come back and say, when I said this to them, the way they said it back to me was different, and I recorded it, and that's how we're going to have to do it from now on. And he would do the same thing on when it was ready to start giving demonstrations, and he would demo it, and then they would say, yeah, but this is what I would do next, not what you just did in the demo. And he would bring that back, and Anders would listen to him and change the product. And I thought, this was genius, and I've retained, that's one of the most important lessons I've retained from Borland, is the power and the importance of product management to get the product right. I mean, if you can't just do, I also understand that sometimes you can't just go into customers with a blank sheet of paper and say, well, here's what I'm thinking of building, and let's talk about it. Because sometimes you actually have to show them a proof of concept or something, right?
Yeah.
But then you're back and forth until you sort of have this concept of a minimum viable product worked out. And they were really good at that. Borland fell apart eventually, but we were both there during some very good years where Borland did, extremely well. I mean, the loyalty that the customers had, that team B, because it was about quality. And I'll talk to people now and I'll say, yeah, we did an alpha, then we would do a beta, we would do we would do beta 1, 2, 3, and then we would do gamma 1, 2, 3, and we would do bug hunts, and we would pay big cash rewards. And people just look at me like I've got two heads.
Yep.
And I said, well, that's how they built really good quality software and had, in those days, 2 million very loyal customers for one product.
Yep. No. And as I say, I leveraged them when I was starting the consulting practice because they were our best promoters.
Hi, the podcast you are listening to is a companion to my recent book, Tech Startup Toolkit: How to Launch Strong and Exit Big. This is the book I wish I'd had as I was founding and running 8 startups over 35 years. It's like a memoir of my entrepreneurial journey. I tell the unvarnished truth about what went right and especially about what went wrong. It's for the founder, the CEO, and wannabe founders of tech and non-tech startups. You can get it from all the usual booksellers and also from the publisher at Manning.com. I hope you like it. It's a true labor of love. Now back to the show.
Delphi still exists today. The funny thing is the company I'm helping at the moment, their product is built in Delphi. And their CTO, who's one of the smartest guys I've met in a long, long time, swears by it. He says, why would I move? It works. It's fast. I can't build anything that small in anything else or as quickly. I mean, we had an opportunity with a customer who wanted us to do something in the data management area that we'd never done before. Over the weekend, he built a solution. And it's all in Delphi. We just don't tell customers that.
No. But I don't know if you know this. I'm sure you do, actually. So Anders got an offer he couldn't refuse from Microsoft. And then he went up there and he did what he said he just never wanted to do when he was at Borland, which is do a C++ version of Delphi. And he called it C#.
Yes. Yep. Yeah. I still remember the horror when he jumped ship.
Oh yeah. It was, we kind of knew that they were tearing us apart at that point.
Yeah. Yeah. But as you say, they were great days. But talking about that made me think of something is when I was at the bank, one of the challenges, we had one of the largest OS2 networks in the world. So Microsoft's OS2, not IBM. And the challenge we had was we had branches all around. So we had client server. So we had servers sitting in the branches running workstations. And the challenge we had was we had to distribute software to them. And so I found a little startup who had built a solution to do something totally different, but it had the capability to be able to transfer bits and bytes from one location to another. And so we worked with them and they repurposed the software to be able to distribute updates to our software all around the country. So again, taking a product that wasn't designed to do something and make it do something else. But then they got bought by a company called Candle Software, who got bought by IBM. So, success story.
Yeah, well, yeah, sure. Okay, so then at a later point, you decided to create a vastly different type of startup, one that's not, I guess, high tech. Yeah. And somewhere along the way, you became a registered barista and a really proficient Greek cook.
Yeah. So yeah, the story behind that is after I left Borland, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, and I was sitting in our local cafe. And we knew the owner pretty well. My wife and I were sitting there, and he said, geez, I hate this business. He said, I need to get out. He said, I wish I could find someone to buy it. Hey, I'll buy it. And so I went from being an IT person to being a cafe owner. And I made all the mistakes that you could possibly make because, hey, how hard can it be? And so what I worked out was to be a successful cafe owner, I had to understand the customers and the business. So I actually went away, did a barista course, did some basic cooking courses, and started to stand behind the counter and would listen to the customers, what they were asking for, etc. And from that, I then went on to create my own menu, which was unique. So my wife is Cypriot, and so I would go and sit down with her father and talk about Greek recipes, etc. And so I created wraps and things that had this Cypriot flavor. But yeah, the mistakes I made was presuming that what I'd learned in IT would work in a cafe, and it didn't. It was very much more about understanding the customer, remembering who they were, what their name was, what kind of coffee they drank, what kind of food they ate. So that's how I ended up being a cafe owner. And then the restaurant was, a friend of mine said, there's a need for a Greek restaurant in this suburb of Sydney called Cronulla. Your cafe is going really well. Why don't you start a Greek restaurant? How hard can it be? And so I made, again, some mistakes. But from that, I learned, again, you've got to understand your customers and what they need, etc. So again, I learned to cook Greek more than I had in the cafe. I learned to make cocktails, etc. Because I figured if I was going to manage people, I had to understand how they felt, how they thought, how they worked. But I also had to understand the customers and what was driving them. So
what was when you first said to the gentleman that wanted out that you wanted to buy it, was it already a Greek food, or was it something completely different?
No, it was a corner shop with a little toaster out the back and a flat pan that he used to cook stuff occasionally on. And so I had to fit it out. So put in a proper kitchen, put in, exhaust, etc. So turn it into a proper cafe, rearranged everything, new counters. So I spent a lot of money to make it look Greek. Got the Greek paintings, etc., to put on the wall. So totally changed it. So from, he would probably do 10 customers a day. We were doing 50, 60, 70 customers a day. I hate to think how many coffees I made in the 5 years we had it.
It just seems to me that owning either a cafe or a restaurant just seems like an exhausting job.
That's why eventually we gave it up. It was just too many hours. Now, being the technologist I am, everything was computerized. So everyone was carrying around Palm Pilots to enter orders, etc. Everything was tracked. All the orders coming in were tracked, etc. So that side of it was pretty well pinned down. But it was, understanding what the customers wanted, how to market to them, why they came back, remembering their names, all that kind of stuff that wrapped around it. That was the change. Plus, it has, having worked in the IT industry for so many years, there is a set of ethics that we ascribe to. The hospitality industry doesn't necessarily have those same ethics.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Are either or both of them still serving Greek food?
No. I sold to Australians in both. So one became it just sold again, and its Greeks have bought it and they've turned it back into a Greek cafe. So after a 10-year gap, it's back to being a Greek cafe and highly successful again. And the restaurant is now a burger shop. So bought by one of the chains down here called Betty's Burgers.
Did you get your members of your family involved in either of those food establishments?
I learned, again, when I bought the cafe, my brother-in-law and his daughters went in to help, and I immediately learned you don't have family in a business. So we parted company after about 3 months, which is when I went in and started to run the business. Yeah.
Okay.
Friends, etc., don't necessarily work.
So one of the things that is has become really obvious to me as I meet lots of founders doing lots of different kinds of startups. Because one of the really fun things about this podcast is that I've had people who are young founders creating a new farming startup, and someone else that's figured out a way to really revolutionize the property management business. But one thing that's really a common thread is that people that do this have a lot of grit. Now, I imagine that everyone who lives in the land of Crocodile Dundee must have a lot of grit.
Yeah. Or stupidity, one of the two.
I used to love that show, but I'm sure I'm dating myself by even mentioning it. Or the not the show, the movies. But
Yeah.
No, seriously, you have exhibited a lot of grit, and I wondered if you could tell us maybe the story of where you think that comes from.
I think it comes from I came from a very working class background. So my father ran a factory where they made wadding, which is what goes into upholstery of chairs, etc. And so plus he was the home handyman. So I was one of 8. And I remember that I think my earliest memory of the house was it was a small cottage in a working class suburb. And over the years, my father would pull out a hammer and put another room on as the family grew. And so it ended up a fairly large house, and he did it all himself. But he had his apprentices, which was my 2 brothers and I. And so we learnt to swing a hammer. But then I think I was about 12 when he put me on the trucks. So every school holidays, he would insist that I didn't sit around and do nothing. So I would be the offsider on the trucks delivering the materials to all the upholsterers around Sydney.
At the age of 12?
At the age of 12. Now, my favorite was I would get a fish cake for lunch from the driver, so that was my reward. But it taught me that you got to work hard. And then when I turned 16 in school holidays, I would be in the factory on the machinery, creating the product. And so I think it came from that you just got to work hard, stick with it. And then when I left school, I really didn't know what I wanted to do and kind of fell into IT by chance, but then quickly worked out that I had affinity for solving problems. And I guess, I remember being called in one day to one of my senior managers who said, "You've got no future in IT." He said, "You'll probably be here another 6 months and then you'll be gone. We'll send you back to the Commonwealth Bank branches." And here I am, 50-something years later, still in IT. So thankfully he was wrong.
And where do you think he is?
Well and truly retired now. But interesting was that he became my mentor in later years in IT. So took me under his wing, and I ended up being his personal assistant for a number of years while we were building one of the largest computer centers in the Southern Hemisphere. So I was part of that team that designed it and commissioned it, etc. So again, great experience. I mean, I think that's, again, one of where the resilience comes from is over that 23 years I was with bank, other than the 5 years I was head of strategic planning, I don't think I ever did one thing for more than 2 years. So I was always doing something different, learning something new, challenging myself. And so I think that helps in later life is that you take all those key learnings, because I still sit down and listen to a customer talking about what their problems are and say, well, we haven't got an exact solution, but I'm sure if we did something else, which is this product we created over the weekend for one of our big prospects, is, hey, surely we can do this. How hard can it be to convert code if you can convert data?
I think you must say, how hard can it be? Quite frequently.
I do.
I've heard you say it 3 times just in this session.
Well, it is. It's about challenge. If someone says, no, we can't do it, my response is always, why not? What is it stopping? Hey, if you can convince me that we can't do it, then I'll back off. But until I've got an answer that satisfies, and again, I think it goes back to my strategic planning background is, I was always looking at what the business needed out of technology and then working out what technology is there out there that might be able to do this, even though it wasn't designed to do that. But yeah, I guess that's where some of the grit comes from. Just always questioning, never accepting that no is a word.
Well, it's definitely one of the things I used to really admire in teams that I built at a startup is that more often than not, these were people whose first instinct is to say yes. This current company, the founding CTO, he was this guy who was a really brilliant hardware architect, and I'm using the past tense because he doesn't work for us anymore. But he was our founding CTO that was with us for 5 years, and if somebody said, "Oh, it'd really be great if the product could do this," and everybody, of course, assumes that, oh, it's going to be a really hard thing to change hardware. But, to him, it was not a lot different than software, because he was essentially, nowadays, you're writing a high-level programming language called System Verilog that's actually designing the hardware for you. And you have what look like functions, and you combine them, and he would come in the next morning and say, yeah, it was a good idea. It works.
Yep.
I mean, of course, at that quick moment, it was working on a simulator, but he would have it then working on hardware and FPGA, the programmable chips that afternoon. So, within 2 days, he'd have it working in hardware. I just think there's so much power to the word yes. And he was a good example of it.
Yeah. Well, when I look back at my career, I think the other thing that I've seen in the entrepreneurs, etc., that there's just something about them that is gonna be successful. So, I mean, when Borland acquired Open Environment Corporation, which you'll be well aware of.
Well, that's the Boston.
Well, we had one of the consultants, a guy, Graham Porter, and Graham said, I've always wanted to be in marketing. And I said, what background have you got? He said, none. But I always wanted to do it. So I said, okay, well, you've got a passion for it. Convince me you can do it. And he turned out really successful. But he then transitioned into running his own business, and he became the lead reseller of Marketo in Australia until Marketo eventually came and set up in their own right, but highly successful. Rob Castaneda, who I hired at Borland, he was a kid, and there was just something about him. I knew he was going to be successful. And now, he's built a global company after starting in a garage in Toongabbie, which is an outer suburb of Sydney. There is another who's now running a Salesforce solution company. So it's just those people, there's something about them, that they're going to be successful because they've got grit and they're prepared to say, yes, I can do that. Or, yes, I'll try it. I might fail, but hey, the the thing I've always felt is if you fail, that means you're trying.
Yeah, it's true. That's true. That's true in this, and it's true in sports too. And we always used to say to somebody that skied the entire day and said, "I didn't fall all day," and it's like, well, then you weren't pushing yourself hard enough.
Yep, correct. Yep, yeah. Just don't make the same mistake twice, is what I always say.
Yeah, well, I'm afraid I have done that in some of the startups where made the exact same mistake twice, and you sort of you see it happening, and you're watching this in slow motion. It's like, wait a minute, I've seen this movie before. I know this. Something's got to change, and then the other thing that's true about startup people is they're incredible optimists, and so. And then that could work against you, which it has for me sometimes. Because then I say, okay, I definitely made this mistake before, but I'm going into this knowing that, and it's going to be different this time.
Yep.
But you don't always have, and you don't have control over, everything in a business situation sometimes.
No.
Well, this has been an absolutely delightful conversation to have with you. And everything I've said to you, I don't know how you're getting it because you're in tomorrow. But it's worked amazingly well. We've got this time warp between us.
Yep.
But anyway,
tomorrow's got to be a nice day.
I am sure of it now. I can see it. Well, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed it.
Yep. Oh, I have too. It's been great to catch up again, and we'll stay in touch.
That's a wrap. Thanks for tuning into this week's episode of the Designing Successful Startups podcast. Check out the show notes for resources and links. Please follow and rate us at podchaser.com/designing successful startups. Also, please share and like us on your social media channels. This is Jothy Rosenberg saying, TTFN, ta-ta for now.